April 14, 1945. Cowra, New South Wales, Australia. The morning sun broke over the prisoner of war compound in waves of amber light, casting long shadows through the wire mesh that divided one world from another. In Block C, a young Japanese naval officer named Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto sat cross-legged on his bunk, turning the pages of a book with the care one might reserve for a sacred text. The book was not sacred. It was a worn copy of Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, its spine cracked from multiple readings, its margins annotated in careful kanji script. Outside his barracks window, the smell of baking bread drifted across the compound from the mess hall. Real bread, white as clouds, soft as the belly of a dove. He had been a prisoner for 8 months. In that time, nothing had confused him more profoundly than this. His captors had given him books. They had given him bread. They had given him, inexplicably, a kind of freedom he had never known even when he wore the uniform of the Imperial Japanese Navy. This was not what he had been told to expect. Lieutenant Yamamoto had been captured in February 1944 after his destroyer was sunk, during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Remembered the moment of surrender with crystalline clarity, the shame that burned hotter than the oil fires on the water, the certainty that his life had ended, even though his body continued to draw breath. In the training camps of Yokosuka, the instructors had been explicit about capture. It was not merely dishonorable, it was a negation of existence. The Senjinkun, the military code promulgated by Emperor Hirohito himself in 1941, stated clearly, "Never live to experience shame as a prisoner. By dying, you will avoid leaving behind the crime of a stain on your honor." To be captured was to cease being Japanese, to become something less than human, to forfeit all claims to dignity or compassion. The Americans, he had been taught, were barbarians who would torture prisoners for information, then execute them. The British and Australians were colonial oppressors who viewed Asian peoples as subhuman. Surrender meant unspeakable degradation followed by certain death. This was the narrative inscribed in every training manual, reinforced in every pre-battle briefing, whispered among soldiers as gospel truth. But Lieutenant Yamamoto had not been tortured. He had not been executed. Instead, 3 days after his capture, an Australian guard had handed him a cup of tea and a thick slice of white bread with butter. 2 weeks later, a Red Cross representative gave him a library card. He still did not understand. The phenomenon that bewildered Lieutenant Yamamoto was not isolated or exceptional. Across the Pacific Theater, from Australia to Hawaii to the continental United States, tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners of war encountered a reality that contradicted everything their military indoctrination had promised. The cognitive dissonance was profound, the psychological impact seismic. These men had been prepared to die. They had been trained to kill. They had not been prepared for libraries, for baseball games, for captors who treated them according to the Geneva Convention. They had not been prepared for abundance. They had not been prepared for kindness. By the war's end, the United States and its allies held approximately 41,000 Japanese prisoners of war in camps scattered across 3 continents. The number was strikingly small compared to the German or Italian POW populations. Over 425,000 Germans alone were held in camps across America because Japanese military culture made surrender almost unthinkable. When surrender did occur, it was often involuntary. Soldiers knocked unconscious by explosions and captured while insensate. Sailors plucked from the ocean after their ships sank. Men so severely wounded they could not resist. The Imperial Japanese Army's surrender rate in the Pacific was less than 3% until the final months of the war. Most Japanese soldiers chose death either in combat or by their own hand, rather than the dishonor of capture. Those who did become prisoners arrived in Allied custody carrying not just the physical wounds of battle but the psychological burden of profound shame. Many refused to eat for days expecting execution. Some attempted suicide. The majority withdrew into states of deep depression, unable to reconcile their continued existence with the values they had internalized since childhood. They were oni, demons, ghosts, the living dead. Japanese military culture had no category for the POW who survived, no script for how such men should behave or be treated. Then they encountered American white bread. The bread became a symbol before it became sustenance, though it was both. In the spring of 1943, at the prisoner of war camp in Tule Lake, California, a newly arrived group of Japanese naval aviators sat in bewildered silence as American guards distributed their first meal. Thick sandwiches on soft white bread, canned fruit, coffee with cream and sugar. The aviators, captured after a failed raid on Dutch Harbor, had not eaten in 3 days. They were emaciated, dehydrated, and convinced they were being fattened for some elaborate form of execution. They did not touch the food. A young Army interpreter, himself a second-generation Japanese-American from Sacramento, entered the mess hall and addressed them in careful, formal Japanese. "This is your daily ration," he explained. "You will receive 3 meals like this every day. The bread is standard issue. There is more if you want it." One of the aviators, a lieutenant named Saburo Sakai, finally spoke. "Why are you feeding us?" The interpreter looked confused. "Because you're prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention requires, why haven't you killed us?" The interpreter paused, weighing his response. "We don't kill prisoners. We follow laws. International laws." The aviators exchanged glances. One of them laughed, a short, bitter sound. "There are no laws in war, only victory and defeat. In America," the interpreter said quietly, "we believe there are laws above war." This exchange, documented in the interpreter's official report, captures the fundamental ideological chasm that separated Japanese POWs from their American captors. The concept of laws governing warfare, rules that constrained military action even against enemies, was alien to men raised in a militaristic culture that viewed war as the ultimate expression of national will, unconstrained by bourgeois notions of humanitarianism. The idea that prisoners possessed rights, that their treatment was subject to international oversight, that their captors were bound by codes independent of military necessity, these were Western constructs that had no analog in Japanese military thought. But the bread was real. The sandwiches were real. The interpreter's words, however incomprehensible, were sincere. Slowly, tentatively, the aviators began to eat. The bread was soft, almost sweet, unlike anything they had tasted. In Japan, rice was the staple. Bread was a luxury item, rarely seen outside urban areas, usually dark and dense when available at all. White bread of this quality, fluffy, tender, abundant, was something they associated with propaganda images of American decadence, the wasteful excess of a soft, materialistic society. Yet here it was, offered daily, without limit or ceremony. Just bread, given to prisoners, to men who had tried to kill Americans just weeks earlier. Saburo Sakai later wrote in his diary, which was preserved in the National Archives, "I did not understand the bread. How could a nation at war give such food to its enemies? Either they were fools, or they had so much that they could afford to be generous even with those who sought their destruction." Both possibilities troubled me. Fools do not win wars, but neither do those who are merely generous. There was something here I did not understand, some quality that had no name in Japanese. The library card that Lieutenant Yamamoto received at Kaura was not an isolated gesture of liberal kindness. It was policy, mandated by the Geneva Convention of 1929, and implemented with characteristic American thoroughness across the POW camp system. Article 17 of the convention stipulated that prisoners of war be afforded opportunities for intellectual and recreational activity, including access to reading materials. The United States, as a signatory, took these obligations seriously, perhaps more seriously than any other belligerent nation. By 1944, every major POW camp in the American system had a library, stocked with books in multiple languages, administered by trained librarians, and expanded through partnerships with the American Library Association and the Red Cross. The libraries were substantial. At Camp Livingston in Louisiana, which held over 500 Japanese POWs by late 1944, the library contained more than 3,000 volumes in Japanese, including classical literature, contemporary novels, technical manuals, and translations of Western works. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, prisoners could check out books by Natsume Soseki, Tanizaki Junichiro, and Kawabata Yasunari, alongside English-language works by Dickens, Steinbeck, and Hemingway. The camp at Angel Island in San Francisco Bay maintained a collection of over 2,000 Japanese-language books, and subscribed to several Japanese-American newspapers. This was not propaganda. The books were not censored beyond the removal of obvious military content. Prisoners could read Marxist philosophy, anti-Western polemics, even nationalist Japanese literature that glorified the very empire they had fought for. The Americans, bound by their interpretation of the Geneva Convention and their own democratic ideals, believed that intellectual freedom was a right that transcended even the status of enemy combatant. To the Japanese prisoners, this was incomprehensible. Corporal Hideo Takahashi, captured on Guadalcanal in November 1942, spent his first 2 months at the POW camp in New Zealand in near catatonic depression. He refused to speak, ate only when forced, and spent hours staring at the barbed wire that enclosed the compound. Then, one afternoon, a New Zealand guard brought him a book, Kokoro by Natsume Soseki, a novel Takahashi had read as a student in Tokyo. He accepted it mechanically, without interest. That evening, unable to sleep, he opened it and began to read. The experience shattered something inside him. Here was a book from home, a work that spoke of Japanese sensibility, Japanese aesthetics, Japanese moral complexity, and it had been given to him by his enemies. Not as mockery, not as psychological torture, simply as a book that a prisoner might want to read. The guard who delivered it had smiled, said something in English that Takahashi didn't understand, and walked away. No ceremony, no explanation, just an act of ordinary human kindness extended to someone who, by all the logic Takahashi had been taught, deserved nothing but contempt. He read the book 3 times in a week. Then he asked for more. Within a month, Takahashi was visiting the camp library twice a week, working his way through the collection with methodical intensity. He read everything: Japanese literature, Western philosophy, American novels, Australian histories. Each book represented another small demolition of the worldview he had carried into captivity. His captors were not barbarians. They possessed culture, learning, traditions of thought as complex as anything in Japan. More disturbingly, they seemed to value those things even in their enemies, even in men who had killed their countrymen, even in the midst of a war for survival. Takahashi began to keep a diary, written in the margins of discarded newspapers. One entry from March 1943 reads, "Today I finished reading Lincoln's Gettysburg Address." The guard translated it for me. Lincoln spoke of government of the people, by the people, for the people. I asked the guard if this was true in America or just words. He thought for a moment and said, "We try. We don't always succeed, but we try." This answer confused me more than a simple yes or no. In Japan, we are taught that power flows from the emperor, who is divine. There is no trying, only obedience. But these Americans speak of trying to live up to ideals they have not yet achieved. They admit imperfection. They seem to believe this is strength, not weakness. I do not understand, but I think it is important. The bread and the books were manifestations of something larger, something that Japanese prisoners struggled to name, because their language lacked the precise vocabulary for it. Systemic abundance married to democratic values. These were not simply wealthy captors offering charity to defeated enemies. This was a society so fundamentally different in its organization, its priorities, and its philosophical foundations that even basic acts of sustenance and education carried meanings that Japanese military culture could not process. Consider the bread again, not as a single loaf but as a system, an infrastructure, an expression of economic and industrial capacity. The white bread that POWs received daily was produced by the same supply chains that fed American troops across the globe. By 1944, the United States was producing over 13 billion pounds of bread and flour products annually for military consumption alone. The industrial bakeries that supplied POW camps used automated systems capable of producing 50,000 loaves per day, with standardized recipes that ensured uniform quality from California to Maine. The wheat came from mechanized farms in Kansas and Nebraska, where a single farmer, using a combine harvester, could do the work of 100 men. The flour was milled in massive facilities, powered by hydroelectric dams built by the Tennessee Valley Authority. The loaves were transported in refrigerated trucks along a highway system that spanned a continent. Japanese prisoners, many of whom came from rural backgrounds where rice was still planted by hand and harvested with sickles, had no framework for understanding this scale of production. In Japan, even before the war's privations, bread was a luxury. By 1943, most Japanese civilians subsisted on rationed rice, soybeans, and whatever vegetables could be grown in urban gardens. The military fared better, but even frontline troops often went days on reduced rations. White bread of the quality served in POW camps simply did not exist in Japanese supply chains. What the prisoners were experiencing, though they lacked the conceptual vocabulary to articulate it, was the material expression of American capitalism at its mid-century apex, an economy that had mobilized not just for war production but for the comprehensive support of a military apparatus that assumed its soldiers, and even its prisoners, would be fed, housed, and cared for according to standards that seemed almost utopian to men from a resource-starved island empire. Lieutenant Yamamoto noted in a letter to his family, written in 1946 after repatriation, and censored by occupation authorities but preserved in archives. In the camp, we ate better than we did in the Navy. I do not mean we ate well by special favor. We ate what American soldiers ate. The guards ate the same bread we did from the same kitchen. I asked one guard why America had so much food when Japan had so little. He shrugged and said, "We're a big country." But it was not just size. China is big. Russia is big. This was something else, a way of organizing that turned land into wealth, wealth into food, food into power. We were taught that Americans were soft, made weak by their comforts. But softness that can feed millions of soldiers and prisoners across an ocean is not weakness. It is strength of a kind we did not understand. The libraries reinforced what the bread implied. American society valued things beyond mere survival, even in wartime, even for enemies. This was the cognitive shock that reverberated through POW camps from 1942 to 1945, gradually eroding the certainties that Japanese military culture had instilled. At Camp Angel Island, a remarkable document circulated among Japanese prisoners in late 1944, a handwritten essay titled "On the Purpose of Libraries in a Democracy," written by a former schoolteacher from Osaka named Kenji Watanabe. Watanabe had been conscripted into the army in 1943, captured on Saipan in July 1944, and transported to California expecting brutality. Instead, he encountered librarians. His essay, translated and preserved by American intelligence officers who recognized its significance, begins. "I have come to understand that the library in this camp is not an act of kindness. It is not charity. It is something the Americans believe they owe to every person, even prisoners, even enemies. They call this a right. In Japanese, we have no word that means precisely this. We have kenri, which means something like right or privilege, but it is something granted by authority, something that can be taken away. The Americans speak of rights as if they are inherent to being human, as if they exist before government and beyond government's power to fully deny. This is why they build libraries in prison camps. Not because they are kind, though some are. Not because they are wealthy, though they are. But because their system is built on the idea that certain things, knowledge, freedom of thought, dignity, belong to humans as humans, not as subjects of an emperor or members of a collective. Watanabe's essay went on to describe his experience reading American political philosophy, Jefferson, Madison, Paine, and comparing it to the Confucian and nationalist ideologies he had absorbed in Japan. He concluded that the fundamental difference lay in where each system located sovereignty. In Japan, sovereignty resided in the emperor and flowed downward through a rigid hierarchy of obligations and duties. In America, sovereignty resided theoretically in the people and flowed upward through institutions designed to reflect popular will. The library in the POW camp was not an anomaly or an eccentricity. It was a structural expression of that philosophical foundation. Even prisoners, temporarily stripped of political participation, retained certain irreducible rights, including access to ideas. This essay circulated among Japanese POWs and sparked intense debate. Some dismissed it as Stockholm Syndrome, a prisoner romanticizing his captors. Others saw it as dangerous heresy, a betrayal of Japanese values. But many found in it a vocabulary for feelings they had been unable to name, the sense that their treatment revealed something profound about the society that had defeated them, something that called into question the narratives that had sent them to war. The transformation of Japanese POWs was not uniform or universal. Many remained committed to the emperor and to the militaristic values of their youth. Some maintained that American generosity was a trick, a sophisticated form of psychological warfare designed to undermine their morale. Others fell into permanent despair, unable to reconcile survival with honor. But a significant number, impossible to quantify precisely but evident in memoirs, letters, and post-war interviews, underwent profound ideological shifts during their captivity. These shifts manifested in small rebellions against their former worldview. At Camp McCoy, Japanese POWs organized a baseball league, adopting an American sport they had previously derided as frivolous. At Camp Livingston, a group of prisoners petitioned for English language classes, taught by American soldiers who volunteered their time. At Cowra, after the violent breakout attempt in August 1944 that left over 200 prisoners dead, surviving POWs began to openly question the militaristic codes that had led their comrades to choose mass suicide over continued captivity. Lieutenant Yamamoto was among those questioners. After the Cowra breakout, in which he did not participate, he wrote a private reflection that was later found among his effects. The men who died believed they were reclaiming their honor. They believed that death in a futile charge against machine guns was preferable to the shame of living as prisoners. I do not know if they were wrong, but I know that I have read books in this camp, books about democracy, about human rights, about societies built on laws rather than on the will of emperors, and these books have given me thoughts I could not have had if I had died in that charge. Perhaps there is honor in survival if survival allows learning. Perhaps the greatest shame is not capture, but the refusal to question what we were taught. This was heresy by the standards of the Imperial Japanese Army. It was also the beginning of a philosophical transformation that would shape post-war Japan. Many of the POWs who experienced Allied captivity returned to Japan with dual perspectives: a deepened appreciation for Japanese culture and identity, but also a recognition that other ways of organizing society were possible, even preferable in some respects. In the chaos of occupation and reconstruction, these men would become quiet voices for reform, for democracy, for the adoption of Western institutions that had, against all expectation, treated them with a measure of dignity when they had expected only death. The symbolism of bread extended beyond nutrition. In Christian societies, bread carries sacramental weight. It is the body made sacred, the staff of life, the substance shared in communion. American POW camp administrators, many of them from Christian backgrounds, may not have consciously intended this symbolism, but it resonated nonetheless. To break bread with an enemy is to acknowledge their humanity. To share food is to create obligation, relationship, community. Japanese prisoners, even those unfamiliar with Christian symbolism, understood the ritual significance of shared meals. In Japanese culture, the act of eating together, itadakimasu before the meal, gochisu-sama after, is itself a form of communion, an acknowledgement of connection between those who eat and those who provided the food. To be fed daily by one's enemies, and to see those enemies eating the same food, sitting at similar tables, subject to the same routines. This created a cognitive dissonance that slowly, almost imperceptibly, eroded the dehumanization that makes war possible. Corporal Takahashi recorded a moment from early 1944 that captured this erosion. He was in the mess hall at the New Zealand camp, eating his usual lunch of sandwiches and canned peaches, when an American officer, a liaison attached to the camp for inspection purposes, sat down across from him. The officer nodded, said something in English, and began eating his own lunch, the same sandwiches, the same peaches. For several minutes they ate in silence. Then the officer pulled out a photograph and showed it to Takahashi, a young woman and two small children, smiling in front of a White House. The officer spoke in halting Japanese, learned from interpreters. "My family, California." Takahashi nodded. He had no photograph to share. Personal effects had been lost when his transport ship sank. But he understood the gesture. This man, this American officer who could have ignored him, who had every right to see him as an enemy combatant who had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, was sharing a small piece of his humanity across the chasm of war and culture and language. Takahashi later wrote, I realized that this man missed his family as I missed mine. He ate the same food as I did. He probably wanted the war to end, to go home, to live in peace. In that moment, I understood that our governments had made us enemies, but we were not, perhaps inherently so. This was not a profound insight. Of course, soldiers on both sides are human. But it is one thing to know this abstractly and another to feel it. Sitting across from a man who shows you his children while you both eat white bread in a prison, camp far from home, the books completed, what the bread began, the reconstruction of Japanese POWs as individuals, with inner lives, moral agency, and capacity for choice. This reconstruction was the antithesis of everything military culture had tried to create. The ideal Japanese soldier was a component of a larger machine, subordinate to the collective will, obedient to authority without question. Individuality was weakness. Doubt was betrayal. The soldier who thought too much or felt too deeply was a failure, but the library demanded thought. It invited doubt. It cultivated individuality by exposing prisoners to ideas that contradicted official narratives. And because the Americans seemed genuinely unafraid of this, because they allowed prisoners access to books that criticized capitalism, that questioned Western colonialism, that celebrated Japanese culture and history, the very openness of the gesture undermined totalitarian certainty. At Camp Lordsburg in New Mexico, a young prisoner named Yoshio Nakamura discovered a Japanese translation of Walden by Henry David Thoreau. Nakamura had been a university student before conscription, studying engineering in Tokyo. He had never heard of Thoreau. The book, with its emphasis on individual conscience, its skepticism of government authority, its celebration of simplicity and self-reliance, struck him as both alien and strangely familiar. Here was an American writer who sounded almost like a Zen monk, preaching detachment from material excess and attention to inner truth. But unlike a monk, Thoreau did not preach obedience to authority. He advocated civil disobedience, the supremacy of personal conscience over unjust laws. Nakamura read the book 3 times, then sought out everything else in the library by or about Thoreau. He learned about Thoreau's night in jail for refusing to pay taxes that would support the Mexican-American War, a conflict Thoreau considered unjust. He learned that in America it was possible to be celebrated as a patriot, even while criticizing one's own government, that dissent could be seen as the highest form of loyalty to national ideals. This was incomprehensible within the framework of Japanese militarism, where criticism of the government or the war effort was treason punishable by death. Yet here was an American thinker, taught in American schools, whose most famous work was essentially a manifesto of non-compliance with state authority. And the Americans had given this book to their prisoners in Japanese translation, with no apparent fear that it would inspire resistance or rebellion. Nakamura later emigrated to the United States after the war and became a professor of comparative literature. In a 1978 interview, he reflected, "Thoreau taught me that democracy is not just a system of government. It is a habit of mind. It is the belief that no authority, not emperor, not general, not president, has the right to command your conscience. You can obey laws for practical reasons, but if those laws violate your deepest sense of right and wrong, you must resist." This idea would have gotten me executed in Imperial Japan, but in America it made a man a hero. That is the difference I learned in the camp, from a book about a man who lived in a cabin in the woods. The difference is not just material abundance. It is moral permission to think for yourself. The epilogue to these experiences unfolded slowly across decades. The Japanese POWs who survived the war returned to a nation in ruins, occupied by the very forces that had imprisoned them. The emperor they had revered as divine announced his humanity in a radio broadcast most had never heard his voice before. The military that had commanded their absolute loyalty was dissolved. The values they had absorbed since childhood were repudiated by a new constitution, drafted by Americans, that enshrined pacifism and democracy as national principles. In this chaos, the lessons learned in POW camps, the exposure to democratic ideals, the experience of legal protections, the memory of being treated with basic human dignity by enemies who could have chosen otherwise, took root in unexpected ways. Former POWs became teachers, business leaders, local officials. They carried with them a dual perspective: pride in Japanese culture and identity, but also a recognition that the militaristic, authoritarian system that had led Japan to war had failed utterly, and that the victors offered an alternative worth considering. Lieutenant Yamamoto returned to Japan in 1946 and eventually became a school teacher in Hiroshima. He never spoke publicly about his time in captivity, but his students remembered him as unusually insistent on the importance of reading widely, of questioning authority, of understanding that strength could take forms other than military power. One student interviewed in 1989 recalled, "Yamamoto-sensei always told us, read everything. Don't accept what you're told until you've thought about it yourself." This was unusual advice in the 1950s, when we were supposed to respect teachers and elders without question. But he seemed to believe that thinking for yourself was more important than obedience. I think maybe he learned this from Americans, though he never said so directly. Corporal Takahashi became a librarian in Tokyo, working to rebuild the city's public library system after the devastation of the war. In a 1960 essay for a professional library journal, he wrote, "A library is an act of faith in human capacity. It assumes that people, given access to information, will make reasonable choices. It assumes that knowledge is valuable not for what it allows the state to do, but for what it allows individuals to become. I learned this in a prison camp in New Zealand, where my enemies gave me books and asked nothing in return except that I read them. I have spent my career trying to create spaces where others can have that experience without first needing to be prisoners." These men were not typical. Most POWs did not undergo such dramatic ideological transformations. Many returned to Japan scarred by the shame of survival, unable to reconcile their experiences with the values they still held. Some committed suicide years after the war ended, unable to bear the dishonor. Others retreated into silence, never speaking of their captivity even to their families. But the exceptional cases mattered because they revealed possibilities. They demonstrated that even the most thorough military indoctrination could be disrupted by sustained exposure to alternative ways of organizing society, alternative values, alternative visions of what it meant to be human. They showed that ideology is not immutable, that minds can change, that the symbols of a culture, bread, books, the rituals of daily life, carry meaning that transcends propaganda. The white bread and the library books were not instruments of deliberate propaganda, though they functioned that way. They were simply the ordinary expressions of a society that, for all its flaws and contradictions, had organized itself around certain principles: abundance through industrialization, freedom through democratic governance, dignity through legal protection. When Japanese prisoners encountered these principles made material, in loaves of bread that never ran short, in books that were freely given, in guards who treated them according to established rules rather than personal whim, they encountered an implicit argument more powerful than any explicit ideology. The argument was this: a society can be wealthy and free simultaneously. Individual rights can coexist with national strength. The rule of law can extend even to those who have violated it most egregiously. These propositions contradicted everything Japanese militarism had taught, which held that national strength required individual subordination, that freedom was weakness, that law was merely the will of the powerful codified as principle. The POW camps became laboratories for this argument, spaces where Japanese soldiers confronted an alternative political philosophy, not through lectures or propaganda, but through lived experience. The results were mixed and complicated. Some prisoners emerged radicalized, convinced that Japanese militarism was fundamentally wrong and that American democracy offered a better path. Others emerged more nationalist than before, viewing American generosity as condescension or as proof that Americans did not understand the true nature of war. Many emerged simply confused, carrying contradictions they would spend the rest of their lives trying to resolve. But very few emerged unchanged. The bread and the books left marks, opened questions, created doubts. In a conflict that killed millions and destroyed cities, these small acts of policy-mandated decency might seem trivial. But they were not. They were seeds planted in foreign soil, and some of them grew into something unexpected. The post-war Japanese democracy that, for all its ongoing challenges and compromises, has endured longer than the empire that preceded it. In the end, the story of Japanese POWs and their bewildering encounters with white bread and library books is not a story about American virtue or Japanese transformation. It is a story about the power of systems, economic, political, cultural, to shape human experience in ways that transcend individual intention. The American guards who distributed bread were not making a political statement. They were following supply protocols. The librarians who stocked Japanese language books were not trying to democratize enemy soldiers. They were implementing Geneva Convention requirements. But the systems behind these acts, the industrial food production, the commitment to international law, the democratic values that informed policy at every level, created experiences that individual actors might never have designed. Those experiences mattered. They mattered to Lieutenant Yamamoto, who learned that reading could be an act of freedom rather than indoctrination. They mattered to Corporal Takahashi, who discovered that enemies could be human in ways that shattered convenient hatreds. They mattered to Yoshio Nakamura, who found in Thoreau a vocabulary for dissent he had never been offered in Japan. And they mattered, eventually, to a defeated nation rebuilding itself in the shadow of occupation, trying to imagine what it might become if it chose a different path. The bread was just bread. The books were just books. But together, they told a story about what a society values, what it protects, what it offers even to those who have tried to destroy it. That story, carried home by prisoners who survived when they expected to die, became part of the foundation on which post-war Japan was built. Not the only part, not even the most important part, but a part nonetheless remembered in the quiet reflections of men who once sat in prison camps, eating soft white bread and turning the pages of books, wondering at the strange generosity of their captors and beginning, slowly, to question everything they had been taught about strength and weakness, honor and shame, victory and defeat. The empire they had served crumbled into dust. The bread endured, and the books and the questions they provoked. Perhaps that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all. Not the military defeat of an enemy, but the slow transformation of consciousness that made former enemies into citizens of a different kind of world, one built not on glory and sacrifice, but on the quiet abundance of a well-fed populace with access to ideas, even dangerous ones, even those that might cause them to rethink who they were and what they believed. That was the freedom they could not understand. That was the democracy they encountered in captivity. That was the America, imperfect and contradictory but undeniably real, that waited for them in the bread and the books, patient as only systems can be, working its slow changes on men who thought they were beyond change, until they looked up from the pages of a book or bit into a slice of soft white bread and realized, with shock and something like wonder, that they were still alive, still thinking, still capable of becoming something other than what their empire had decreed. And in that realization lay the seed of a different future, one where defeated soldiers might return home not to death and dishonor, but to the possibility of transformation, where questions might be valued over certainties, where the kindness of enemies might plant doubts that grew into convictions, where white bread and library books might matter more, in the end, than all the weapons ever forged.